When a dismissive avoidant goes silent and you go silent too, this isn't a standoff. It's the most uncomfortable psychological shift they experience. Because for the first time, no one is chasing and no one is escaping. At first, they feel relief, but relief is not peace. When contact stops on both sides, the dismissive avoidant experiences an immediate sense of lightness, almost like they finally exhaled after holding their breath for too long. The absence of messages feels calming. There are no expectations waiting for them, no emotional gravity pulling at their attention, no subtle pressure to respond, explain, reassure, or show up in ways that feel draining to their nervous system. Silence to them feels clean, controlled, safe. In this phase, they often interpret the quiet as proof that they made the right choice. Inside their mind, a quiet narrative begins to form. This is what I needed. I finally have space. I can think clearly again. What they don't realize is that this relief isn't the same as emotional regulation. It's emotional avoidance, temporarily dressed up as freedom. The calm they feel doesn't come from resolution or understanding. It comes from the removal of stimulation. Their nervous system isn't healed. It's simply no longer being activated. And for a dismissive avoidant, that distinction is everything. They mistake the absence of discomfort for growth, when in reality, nothing has been processed at all. During this phase, they may even feel emotionally efficient, productive, focused. They might sleep better for a few nights. They might feel more in control of their time and energy. This reinforces the belief that distance equals stability. But this sense of order is fragile. It relies entirely on one thing staying true, that the silence remains uncontested, unquestioned, and unexamined. The moment that stillness is challenged by memory, curiosity, or the realization that you are also not reaching out, the relief begins to thin. Because relief built on avoidance always has an expiration date. It works only as long as nothing asks anything of them emotionally. And the problem with mutual silence is that it eventually does exactly that. When both of you stop contacting each other, the avoidant loses the external confirmation that they were needed, wanted, or emotionally central, even if they claimed not to want that role. The silence starts to feel less like freedom and more like a vacuum. That's when subtle discomfort creeps in, not as longing, not as missing you, but as a quiet sense that something unfinished is floating just beneath the surface. Their relief starts to feel hollow. The calm becomes flat. And what once felt like space slowly begins to feel like emotional disconnection from something that mattered more than they initially admitted. This is the moment where the false relief phase quietly ends. Not with drama, not with regret, but with the first crack in the story they told themselves to feel. What they weren't prepared for was your silence. Dismissive avoidants are not regulated by closeness. They're regulated by certainty. Specifically, the quiet certainty that they are wanted, desired, emotionally significant. Even if they keep that desire at a distance, they may reject bids for connection, minimize emotions, or pull away when intimacy increases. But beneath that detachment is an unspoken expectation. If I disappear, they'll still be there. That expectation acts as an invisible safety net for the ego. It allows them to withdraw without truly feeling the risk of loss. Your silence removes that net. When you stop reaching out genuinely, completely, something unfamiliar settles in. There are no texts lighting up their phone, no emotional bids looking for a response, no subtle check-ins that say, I still care, even if you don't. And for the first time, there is no external evidence that they are still important in your emotional world. This isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's quiet. And that quiet is what makes it destabilizing. At first, they may rationalize it. They're just busy. They're trying to get my attention. They'll reach out eventually. But as time passes and the silence remains steady, not reactive, not performative, a subtle shift begins to occur. The absence stops feeling temporary. It starts to feel intentional. And intention is what triggers the ego shock. Dismissive avoidants are deeply uncomfortable when they can't locate themselves in someone else's emotional landscape. They don't need reassurance, but they need relevance. Your silence creates a blank space where their position used to be. No feedback. No reflection, no proof that they still occupy a meaningful role, and that blank space becomes impossible to ignore. This is when the thought appears quietly, almost intrusively. Why aren't they reaching out? Not because they want closeness, not because they suddenly miss you, but because the expected response is missing. The pattern has been disrupted. Their nervous system was prepared for pursuit, or at least a signal of lingering attachment. It was not prepared for mutual withdrawal. And here's the part most people misunderstand. This moment isn't about you chasing or proving your worth. It's about their internal regulation breaking down. Without your attention, their sense of control weakened. The ego, which once felt stable because it was being reflected back, now sits in stillness with nothing to lean on. No validation to reject, no desire to dismiss, just quiet. That stillness forces awareness, awareness of risk, awareness of uncertainty, awareness that you may not be waiting anymore. And for a dismissive avoidant, uncertainty is far more unsettling than conflict. Silence doesn't threaten them with emotion, it threatens them with irrelevance. This is the ego stillness shock. The moment they realize that the dynamic no longer revolves around their distance, that you didn't protest, you didn't pursue, you simply stop. And in that stop, something inside them has to adjust because the story where they are wanted but unchallenged can no longer hold. They didn't lose you yet, but they lost control. When both of you stop contacting each other, something subtle but profound happens inside the dismissive avoidant. The familiar rules of the dynamic disappear. Up until now, the relationship operated on an unspoken structure they understood well. When things felt too close, they pulled away. When the distance felt too wide, they reappeared just enough to stabilize the bond. This push-pull wasn't accidental, it was a form of regulation. Distance gave them power. Re-engagement gave them reassurance. And as long as they could move in and out at will, they felt in control. Mutual silence removes that option. When you stop contacting them, not as a tactic, not as a test, but as a genuine withdrawal, the dismissive avoidant can no longer define the pace or direction of the connection. They can't pull away to regain power because you're already gone. They can't reappear to reset the bond because there's no guarantee you'll respond the same way. And they can't use distance as leverage because distance no longer belongs exclusively to them. What once felt like a tool now feels irrelevant. This is where control quietly slips, not dramatically, not all at once, but internally. The sense of authority they once felt over the emotional landscape begins to erode. The dynamic no longer orbits around their comfort level. There is no longer a clear chaser or distancer. Instead, the relationship enters neutral territory, a space where no one is actively reaching, pursuing, or reacting. And dismissive avoidants hate neutrality. Neutrality offers no feedback, no confirmation, no emotional signal to push against or retreat from. It strips the dynamic of hierarchy. There is no upper hand in silence that is mutual and sustained. Without contrast, without you leaning in while they lean out, the position becomes undefined. And an undefined position feels dangerously close to loss. What makes this phase especially destabilizing is that nothing appears to be happening. From the outside, it looks like nothing. From the inside, it feels like standing on shifting ground. The avoidant can't tell if you're waiting, healing, detaching, or moving on, and that ambiguity removes their ability to manage outcomes. Control relies on predictability. Silence, when shared, destroys predictability. They may feel an urge to do something, anything, just to reassert influence. A casual message, a neutral reaction on social media, a breadcrumb designed to test whether the old dynamic still exists. But even that feels risky now, because reaching out means admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty is the one position they avoid the most. This is the moment where power subtly rebalances. You haven't confronted them. You haven't demanded clarity. You haven't chased. You've simply stopped participating in a pattern that once gave them control. And in doing so, you've removed the structure that allowed them to feel safe without being vulnerable. They didn't lose you yet, but they lost the advantage of distance. And for a dismissive avoidant, that loss is far more unsettling than it looks, because control was never about you. It was about keeping themselves emotionally protected. Distance doesn't erase you, it edits you. When there is no new emotional data coming in, no messages, no conflict, no emotional bids, The dismissive avoidance mind begins to do something it couldn't do while you were still present. It starts to reorganize memory. In real time, closeness often felt overwhelming to them. Emotions blurred together. Expectations felt heavy. But distance creates a different psychological environment. With the stimulus removed, the nervous system settles enough for reflection to begin, and reflection changes the way you are remembered. Without new interactions to reinforce defensiveness, the mind no longer needs to stay on guard. The arguments fade first. The moments where they felt pressured or misunderstood lose their emotional charge, not because they were insignificant, but because there is nothing new feeding that narrative. Emotional intensity requires fuel. Silence starves it. And in that quiet, something softer rises. Their memory begins replaying unfiltered moments, not the tense conversations or unresolved disagreements, but the moments that felt emotionally safe. Your calm presence, the way you listened without forcing, the way you were there without demanding more than they could give. These memories weren't dominant when the relationship was active because closeness triggered their defenses. But now, with distance acting as a buffer, those defenses relax. This is where avoidants often confuse themselves. They don't suddenly feel regret. They don't consciously think, I miss them. Instead, they experience an emotional shift they can't quite name. The image of you becomes warmer, less critical, less threatening. You no longer represent pressure. You represent stability, safety, ease. Distance allows their brain to edit the emotional soundtrack attached to you. Where there was once tension, there is now neutrality. Where there was once frustration, there is now appreciation. And appreciation feels safer than desire. It doesn't ask for action. It doesn't demand vulnerability. It simply exists. This is the memory softening phase, the point where nostalgia quietly replaces defensiveness. Nostalgia doesn't feel dangerous to a dismissive avoidant. It feels contained, manageable. It allows them to revisit the connection without feeling trapped by it. And because there is no current interaction to contradict this softened version of you, the mind leans into it. They may catch themselves smiling at a random memory, hearing your voice in their head during a quiet moment, remembering something small you used to do that brought comfort rather than stress. These moments aren't dramatic, they're subtle, fleeting, almost accidental, but they matter. Because once the memory of you shifts from overwhelming to safe, the internal narrative begins to change. This is not the moment they reach out. This is the moment they stop needing to justify why they didn't. And that distinction is critical. Defensiveness keeps distance intact. Nostalgia dissolves, it slowly, from the inside. And once the mind no longer needs to protect itself from the memory of you, the silence between you starts to feel heavier. Not because of loss, but because of meaning. They don't miss you, but something feels wrong. Dismissive avoidants almost never experience emotional absence in the way others do. They don't sit with a clear sense of longing. They don't frame their internal discomfort as missing someone. Longing would require emotional ownership, and ownership feels unsafe. So instead, what emerges is something far more confusing, an unnamed unease that has no obvious source. On the surface, nothing is wrong. Life is moving. The silence continues. There's no conflict demanding attention, yet internally, their emotional system feels off balance. They may feel restless for no reason, an urge to stay busy, distracted, stimulated, anything to avoid sitting still with the sensation. Quiet moments become uncomfortable. Stillness feels heavy instead of peaceful. This unease often shows up as irritation. Small things annoy them more than usual. People feel slightly intrusive, conversations feel shallow or draining, there's a subtle edge to their mood that doesn't match their circumstances. They may snap internally at situations that never bothered them before without understanding why. Then there's the emotional flatness, the muted feeling that nothing is quite satisfying. Not sad, not happy, just dull. Activities that once brought relief now feel ineffective. They scroll longer, stay out later, numb themselves with work, entertainment, or routine. Not because they're avoiding you consciously, but because they're avoiding the discomfort of not knowing what's missing. And beneath all of this sits a low-grade anxiety. They can't explain, not panic, not fear, just a quiet tension that hums in the background, a sense that something is unresolved, unfinished, but because there's no obvious emotional label for it, the mind searches for logic instead of meaning. Am I stressed? Bored, burnt out, they look everywhere except toward the emotional absence that created the imbalance. They don't think, I miss them. That would feel too vulnerable, too exposed. Instead, the thought that surfaces is far more indirect. Why don't I feel settled? Why does relief no longer feel relieving? Why does the silence feel heavier than it did at first? These questions don't come with answers, only with awareness that something inside hasn't returned to equilibrium. This is the point where avoidance begins to fail as a coping strategy. The discomfort doesn't go away with distance, it lingers. It follows them into quiet rooms and idle moments. And because dismissive avoidants are highly attuned to internal disruption, even if they don't understand its emotional origin, this unsettled state becomes hard to ignore. What makes this phase powerful is that the unease isn't attached to you as a person, yet it's attached to the absence of what you represented. Emotional regulation, familiarity, a steady presence they didn't know they relied on. And because there's no current conflict to blame, no pressure to resist, the mind slowly zones inward. This is not missing. This is disorientation. The feeling of walking on stable ground and suddenly realizing the ground has shifted quietly without warning. And once that realization sets in, the silence between you begins to feel less like freedom and more like a question that hasn't been answered. Your silence forces them to confront something they avoid the most themselves. Dismissive avoidants rely on external dynamics to define who they are inside a relationship, not through closeness, but through contrast. Your reactions, your adjustments, your emotional bids once served as a mirror, a way for them to locate themselves without having to look too deeply inward. When you responded, reassured, or even protested their distance, it confirmed a familiar role, the independent one, the emotionally contained one, the one who didn't need much. Your silence removes that mirror. Without you reacting, adjusting, or reaching out, they lose the reference point that helped them maintain emotional stability. There's no longer a reflection showing them as desired but distant, needed but unavailable. And without that reflection, a quiet disruption begins in their sense of identity. Not dramatic, not obvious. Just a subtle fracture in the story they've been telling themselves about who they are and how they affect others. This is when questioning begins. Not as self-blame, but as confusion. Did I matter more than I thought? If you mattered less, you would have chased. If you were unimportant, you would have protested the silence. Your lack of reaction challenges the assumption that they were emotionally central while remaining untouched by consequence. The absence of pursuit introduces a new, unsettling possibility. Maybe they misjudged their role. Then comes a deeper question, one they don't like sitting with. Was I the one who messed this up? Not in a dramatic, guilt-ridden way, but in a quiet, destabilizing way. They start replaying moments not to defend themselves, but to understand why the dynamic didn't correct itself, why the silence didn't bend back in their favor, why the pattern they trusted failed. And then there's the most uncomfortable question of all. Why didn't they fight harder or at all? This question hits the core of the avoidance internal contradiction. They fear emotional pursuit, yet unconsciously expect it. They resist closeness, yet rely on being wanted. Your silence breaks that paradox. It forces them to consider that maybe you didn't see them as something to win, or worse, that you chose yourself instead. This isn't regret yet. Regret implies clarity, accountability, ownership. What's happening here is more fragile. It's self-fracture, the moment where the internal image they had of themselves no longer fits the reality unfolding around them. The role they were comfortable in suddenly feels incomplete. The narrative where they are detached but desired begins to crack. And cracks are dangerous for dismissive avoidance. They expose depth. They invite reflection. They threaten the emotional armor built to keep vulnerability at bay. Without your presence to anchor the old identity, they are left alone with questions they can't immediately silence or explain away. This phase often feels internally unsettling because it doesn't come with answers, only awareness. Awareness that the silence isn't just about distance anymore, it's about consequence, about impact, about who they are when no one is chasing, adjusting, or waiting. And once identity is disrupted, the emotional ground beneath them is no longer stable. They may try to distract themselves, reassert independence, double down on detachment, but something has already shifted. The mirror is gone, and without it, They can no longer avoid the one thing they've been protecting themselves from all along. The truth of how much they mattered and how much they were affected in return. They want to reach out and they're terrified of doing it. This is the peak tension phase, the moment where everything inside the dismissive avoidant pulls in opposite directions at once. The distance has gone on long enough to disrupt their sense of control, soften their memory of you, and fracture their internal narrative. And now a new urge begins to surface, not as longing, but as impulse. The impulse to reestablish contact, to confirm their place, to reduce uncertainty. But the very act that could relieve the tension is the same act that threatens their emotional safety. They feel the urge to check your socials, not obsessively, but reflexively. A quick scan, a subtle search for clues. Are you okay? Are you thriving? Are you still the person they left? Each post becomes a data point, not for closeness, but for positioning. They may reread old messages, looking for tone, warmth, or unresolved connection, not to relive the bond, but to reassure themselves that it existed on their terms. And then comes the mental drafting, the casual reach out, something light, neutral, low risk, a message designed to look effortless while carrying emotional weight underneath. Hey, just thought of you. Hope you're doing well. Random question. The goal isn't intimacy, it's testing the waters. Will you respond? How fast? With what energy? Are they still safe to re-enter without consequence? But every version of that message runs into the same wall, risk. Reaching out means risking rejection, not just the pain of being ignored, but the blow to their self-concept. If you don't respond or respond differently, it confirms a loss of relevance they're not prepared to face. It also means emotional exposure. Even a neutral message requires admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty is vulnerability in disguise. And then there's the deepest fear of all, the loss of superiority. The fear that reaching out places them in the lower position, the one who wants more, or at least wants something. So they don't send it, they wait. And waiting makes it worse. Every day of silence adds weight to the decision. The longer they wait, the more meaning the reach out carries. What could have been casual now feels loaded. What could have been light now feels like a statement. And the tension builds, not outwardly, but internally. They become stuck between two intolerable positions, reaching out and risking exposure, or staying silent and sitting with the discomfort of unresolved connection. This push-pull isn't about indecision. It's about identity preservation. The part of them that wants relief is fighting the part of them that equates vulnerability with loss. And because dismissive avoidants are trained to choose self-protection over emotional resolution, they often default to inaction, convincing themselves that time will settle the feeling. But time doesn't settle it, it amplifies it. Silence turns into pressure, curiosity turns into anxiety, and the urge to reach out doesn't disappear, it deepens. The internal conflict becomes harder to ignore because the stakes feel higher now. Reaching out isn't just about you anymore. It's about whether they can tolerate being seen in a moment of uncertainty. This is the phase where everything feels suspended, where action feels dangerous and inaction feels unbearable. And whichever choice they make next, to speak or to stay silent, will no longer be casual. It will be a response to the tension that's been building, quietly, relentlessly, inside them. Silence doesn't punish a dismissive avoidant. It destabilizes them. Most people assume that ignoring a dismissive avoidant is a tactic to make them miss you or feel guilty, but that's not how their mind works. Silence doesn't feel like punishment. It doesn't trigger regret in the way a conscious loss or confrontation might. Instead, it destabilizes. It interrupts the internal script they rely on to feel safe in the world of relationships. When you stop engaging, you stop participating in the dynamic they depend on, and suddenly the rules they thought were predictable no longer apply. Silence communicates something far more powerful than words ever could. It communicates self-respect. It shows that you are not willing to compromise your emotional balance to manage their distance, to chase their attention, or to negotiate your value in their terms. By choosing quiet, you assert that your time, energy, and emotional presence are yours first and that they are no longer negotiable. This is terrifying to a dismissive avoidant, because their internal system expects the other person to accommodate their withdrawal. When that accommodation stops, the structure they've relied on begins to wobble. Silence also communicates emotional independence. It tells them that your mood, your validation, and your presence are no longer contingent on their behavior. You exist fully outside their orbit. You are no longer a mirror they can control or manipulate to feel safe. And for someone whose self-concept is partially defined by how others respond to their emotional distance, this is profoundly unsettling. They no longer have the reassurance that their actions, withdrawal, or charm will elicit a predictable response. The equilibrium they trusted is gone. Non-attachment is the final message silence sends. You are no longer tethered to their rhythm. You are not waiting. You are not pursuing. You are not reacting. And when a dismissive avoidant observes this, it introduces a new variable into their mental landscape: uncertainty. No longer are you the safe constant, the predictable object of avoidance and return. Instead, you become a question mark. And question marks are magnetic. They draw attention not because of desire or longing, but because the mind is wired to resolve uncertainty. Your absence triggers curiosity, introspection, and subtle recalibration of their own emotional state. The destabilization is quiet at first, a twinge of thought when they notice you haven't reached out, a moment of curiosity about what you are doing, a subtle internal questioning of your relevance. But over time, the tension builds. Because dismissive avoidants are used to controlling distance, managing perception, and regulating connection on their own terms. Your silence strips them of all that control. They are left with only questions, no answers, and no way to predict your next move. In that space, the dynamic shifts completely. You are no longer a source of pressure, an object to manage, or a participant in their emotional script. Instead, you exist as an independent entity, untouchable, self-contained, and unknowable. And that is exactly what draws them in the absence of manipulation, chasing, or neediness. Your silence becomes a magnetic force, pulling their attention not through drama, but through the quiet power of mystery, independence, and self-possession. This is why silence doesn't punish. It doesn't need to. It changes everything. This is where two futures split. After weeks, sometimes months, of mutual silence, the relationship reaches a pivotal moment, a juncture where everything can go one of two ways. For the dismissive avoidant, the internal pressure created by your absence has been building quietly but relentlessly. Their memory has softened, their ego has been unsettled, their identity has been disrupted. Their nervous system has wrestled with the tension between desire and self-protection. And now, with no external cues guiding them, they are standing at an invisible fork in the road. On one path, they suppress everything. They push down the subtle stirrings, the creeping curiosity, the twinge of uncertainty your silence has introduced. They retreat further into emotional detachment, convincing themselves that their distance is permanent and justified. They rationalize the absence, strengthen the walls around their vulnerability, and emotionally check out. In this scenario, the relationship doesn't just pause, it dissolves internally, quietly, without confrontation or drama. The connection exists in memory only, and the potential for reconnection fades, sometimes permanently. On the other path, their curiosity overtakes their fear. The internal tension, the unanswered questions, the subtle longing or recognition of what was lost finally outweighs the instinct to protect themselves. They feel the urge to reach out, cautiously at first, testing the waters. This is not impulsive, it's deliberate, it's calculated, and it's driven by the internal need to resolve uncertainty, to understand what changed, what you became, and whether the dynamic can be restored on new terms. It's the point where the silence you maintained becomes the bridge for potential reconnection. But what decides which path they take? Not time. Not the mere fact that you stayed silent. The passage of days alone is irrelevant. Silence without substance is ineffective. What truly determines the outcome is who you became during that silence. Your growth, your calm, your self-possession, and your unshakable independence. These are the signals your absence sends. Silence itself is empty unless it carries the weight of your transformation. They don't just respond to the void, they respond to the presence of someone they can't fully predict, someone who is not tethered to them emotionally, yet is undeniably whole and composed. The fork in the road is subtle but decisive. One path leads to permanent emotional withdrawal, the other to cautious engagement. Their choice is less about you and more about the contrast between what they expected and what they actually encounter. If your silence reflected neediness, impatience, or confusion, it reinforces their detachment. If your silence reflects strength, self respect, and non attachment, it ignites curiosity, introspection, and the possibility of return. At this stage, everything hinges on the power you quietly hold within yourself, not through words, not through chasing, not through proof, but through presence. Your evolution during the silence is the magnet that pulls them toward one future or the other. The fork is inevitable. The choice they make will reveal who was truly driving the dynamic all along them, or the calm, composed energy you embodied in absence. When a dismissive avoidant and you both stop contacting each other, the silence doesn't end the story. It reveals who had power, who had growth, and who was only pretending to be okay. And if they do come back, what you say next determines everything.